Hello and welcome to West Country Wanderings. Welcome to another one in my canal series, and we're back looking at secrets of the Thames and Severn Canal. It's actually the 6th video I've done in this series. The last one was about 4 months ago, and I was actually here talking about Gloucestershire County Council's involvement with restoring parts of the canal to make it navigable at the end of the 19th and early 20th century. Remember, we were talking about the concrete lining along this section of what is known as the King's Reach. In actual fact, there was a gentleman called a Mr. Caney back in the 18th century who came along here, and when he was along here admiring the handiwork of all the navvies of what they'd done on this section of the King's Reach, a gentleman approached him and gave him a gold sovereign. That gentleman was the King. And it's that king, King George, I think it was King George III, that this King's Reach is named after. Yeah, imagine that. The king just giving you a sovereign as you're walking by. Incredible, isn't it? But yes, that's not the topic of our little tale, this little secret of the TNS, as it's affectionately known here. Part of the Cotswold Canals, of course, linking the mighty River Severn to the equally mighty River Thames, which lies further on towards the east at Lechlade-on-Thames, also here in Gloucestershire. What we're going to be looking at today, and this will be part 1 of perhaps 3 separate parts. So yeah, I realise it's a part of Secrets of the Thames and Severn Canal, but there's a special reason for that. We're going to be talking about probably the most well-known and most famous and celebrated history of the Thames and Severn, and that, of course, is the Sapperton Tunnel. Now, the coats portal of the Sapperton Tunnel lies just a little bit further along there, along the towpath, underneath the brilliant Tarleton Bridge. But we're making our way along there. As I do so, be telling you about the history, the extensive history, fascinating and unbelievable history of how this amazing tunnel was constructed back in the 18th century. It's an amazing tale. I can't possibly fit it all in one video, hence why it's going to be in 3 parts, obviously going into the new year. So yes, part 1 of the Sapperton Tunnel, the secrets of the Sapperton Tunnel, here on the Thames and Severn Canal in Gloucestershire. Now, it's barely inconceivable now, but when the Sapperton Tunnel was first envisaged, the word tunnel had only just been coming into use in its modern meaning. So obviously we know what the word tunnel means now, we can envisage that. But it wasn't really a common thing in those days, it wasn't a thing on canals. In fact, there was only one canal that had come before this one, and that was the Harecastle Tunnel. And I'll talk a little bit more about that tunnel now, because that came before this one, and up until that point it was the longest canal on any canal in the United Kingdom. Now, the Harecastle Tunnel, or should I say the first Harecastle Tunnel, because there was a later one, was on the Trent and Mersey Canal in Staffordshire, linking Kidsgrove to Tunstall. And that was opened, it started around 1770, and it was opened in 1771 by the famous canal engineer James Brindley, who I'm sure you would have all heard of. And that one was 2,880 yards. I'll put that, what that is in proper money in metres. I'm a metres person. I never did yards at school, even though I went to school in the 60s. So that was established as being the biggest tunnel. There was a later one and there was extensions to it, but I won't go into that because that's not in our area though. But that set a precedent for canal tunnels even in the United Kingdom until the one we're about to go to now. So there's the portal, Coates portal of the Sapperton Tunnel, 3,817 yards long. And it was not only longer than the Harecastle Tunnel there in Staffordshire, but it was also wider, being 15 feet high by 15 feet across. Quite an ambitious undertaking. Now, Robert Whitworth, the chief engineer for the Thames and Severn at that time, had said to the committee that were building this, commissioning to have this canal built here in Gloucestershire, and also part of Wiltshire as it approaches the River Thames, that it would be quite an undertaking, and with that was quite an understatement, wasn't it? Because he couldn't give them an exact costing of how much this was cost to build. And the reason for that was that they were digging, or were going to be digging, into an unknown quantity of geology. And we'll touch on that in the later videos in this series looking at the Sapperton Tunnel, because it caused an enormous amount of problems and still does. But first, how did the construction take place? How did they do it? How did they engineer it? Most important of all, how did they keep it in a straight line underneath the Cotswold Hill? Now, Robert Whitworth, the engineer, gave the committee an estimated cost to build the Sapperton Tunnel of £36,575. Now, oddly, what we do know is it costs much more than that to build, a lot more. But strangely for the TNS, because much of it is documented with extensive archives, we really don't know what the total cost of it was. Now, going back to how they built this in a straight line from the Sapperton Tunnel portal down there near the village of Sapperton to here near the village of Coates is an oddity, because scientifically it hadn't been done until 1819, some 40 odd years later, when construction started, this one here in Gloucestershire. And that was done on the Frinsby Tunnel on the Thames and Medway Canal, where my era, in Kent, southeast area. So yeah, some 40 years later, and that was using a device called a transit telescope. I don't really know how that works. I'm sure you'll be able to Google that if you're interested to know more about a transit telescope. But they certainly didn't have such a thing here when they were building the Sapperton Tunnel. So what did they do? Now, what they did was really quite simple. Now, if you imagine that you're building, say, a garden wall, or any wall indeed, brick wall, and you want to make it straight, you put a line of cord out, just do it on the ground so you know it's dead straight, or a long ruler, anything that is straight, you pull it taut. Obviously the distance here is much, much more than that. We're talking about a couple of miles or so. So what they did was they placed a cord from the Sapperton end, where they wanted to start digging, right through down to here at the Coates end. Now, how the construction of this tunnel was done wasn't just simply starting at one end and digging like a mole, burrowing through, and then the other, because if you think about it, that wouldn't work very well, because you've got to move out all the rock and soil and everything that's underneath there to get it out. That is not an easy way of doing it. So a series of shafts were sunk, and these shafts, and which we'll go and have a look at a little bit later in today's video, part one of the Sapperton Tunnel, they were sunk along the line of the cord. So you've got this cord pinned at one end, pinned at the other, and along the line of that you had this series of shafts. I think there are around about 28, although they're not evenly spread for reasons I'll come on to mention later. And you can then sink that shaft down, and you measure that using a plumb line. Now, you have to do this on a calm day, because if you've got a wind blowing, it's going to move like that, isn't it? So you need to do it on a calm day, so you can then sink your shaft right down to the bottom, and when you've got your plumb line down the shaft, you can then start burrowing an outwards and inwards direction underground till it meets up to the same process that's happening on the adjacent shafts. So then you're joining everything up. Despite all of that though, despite all the precautions taking place with not choosing a windy day, making sure the cord was absolutely straight, it wasn't tangled around a tree or anything between here and Sapperton, nothing like that. It was a cause of extreme anxiety for the navvies building this, a bit like, I suppose, when they were building the Channel Tunnel back there in the, when was it, the 1980s, 1990s, when they made that famous join under the middle of the English Channel. A bit like that. Amazingly, even though they weren't using laser guides like they use these days, nothing like that at all, satellites, just using that cord and the plumb line and all of that, they were only tiny little fractions out. And when the tunnel was completely completed, you could stand there. So when this was open, you could stand in the bottom of the canal bed there and look right down through the tunnel and see the Sapperton portal, light shining through it, the other, even though it was a tremendously long tunnel. Sadly, you can't do that these days because of the number of rockfalls. There's at least 2 rockfalls inside there, and that's why that metal fence is there, to prevent anybody trying to go in there. Certainly don't recommend anybody goes in there unless you've got special permission and safety checks have been carried out, because of the rockfalls, and it's also very unstable these days. Well, welcome back after the break. I'm now come around to Hayley Wood, which is about half a mile further on. So if you walk along the Monarch's Way towards the former Tunnel House Inn, the building is there, but sadly it's closed. Hopefully it will reopen again one day. And this is, of course, part of the Cirencester Park, Lord and Lady Bathurst's estate. This here is one of the air shafts. So this is how they built the Sapperton Tunnel. This one, I believe, is the first one from the direction of Coats Tunnel. I think I said earlier on that there were 28 air shafts. There's actually 25, but they're built at sporadic intervals, varying between 30 yards apart. Maybe have a look at that later on. It's near the railway line. And I think the furthest distance apart is some 400 yards, 414 yards apart. So how big were these and how do they all work? Well, they're about 8 foot in diameter in old money. As you can see there, it's fenced off, thankfully, although it's partially filled in this one. You can't see right down to the canal bed down below in the tunnel. But this would have been dug out like a well, in effect. Part of it later on was masonry lined, like you'd build a well, and it was sunk back. So as they were digging down, the bricks would kindly sink further back into the mud, into the rock bed. And then it went right down. Now, when the shaft had then been completed, they could use this shaft to lower men into what would later become the canal tunnel. They could also use it to remove all the rubble and rock and lift it out. So what you had was some headgear here. Initially, it would have been man-driven, but later on, when you had all that weight of that rock coming out, they needed something more substantial. So what they had was a horse gin, which is effectively a horse walking around in a circle, driving a gearing mechanism, which would then lower and raise buckets. Yeah, simple as that, buckets going up and down what is effectively a well. This would later become an air shaft. Of course, you need those air shafts after the canal has been completed, and you've got people going through them on tugboats, narrowboats, the Thames barges. Because of the length of the tunnel, you need a flow of air. That's why you have them in the neighbouring Sapperton Railway Tunnel, which is probably a story for another day here on West Country Wanderings. But yes, this is one of the air shafts here in Hayley Wood, and that is a key feature of how this Sapperton Tunnel was built. So you can imagine these were strung out on a line through the wood here. Would it still have been a wood there? You can actually see spoils, so there's humps around here, around where the air shaft is, where literally they would have pulled that rock out, and then the spoil from what they dug out as they were constructing the tunnel was literally dumped here inside Hayley Wood. Let's go over and see if we can find another one and tell you a little bit more about the story of the construction of the Sapperton Tunnel, because things are about to get really, really interesting. So we've now come a little bit closer to the railway line. I'll put a map in now so you can see. In fact, there's 2 air shafts quite close to here. So we've got this one here, which is on the ground at least here. Looks a lot deeper, of course, they're all the same depth down to the canal bed inside the tunnel. Needs to be level, of course. And there's another one just the other side of the fir tree wood. I've just seen a couple of deer chase off as well, huge deer. I imagine there's loads here in Hayley Wood. This must have been an interesting experience for the canal navvies working here. It was obviously very, very hard and very dangerous work. And one of the reasons for the dangers of this work here, apart from the dangers of collapses, whether we're digging underground, is also water, because there's various springs along the line here. Something that the builders of the Severn Tunnel, the railway tunnel between, well, effectively Bristol and Cardiff, you know where I mean. When they were constructing that, they had problems there. Something we'll do a video about next year, hopefully, separately. But yes, here they had water ingress. Now, the easiest way to remove that water is to make a headway. So once you've completed the full length of the tunnel, even if it's just a narrow bore, the water will naturally flow out from one end to the other. Then you can, of course, widen it at your leisure. But in the interim period, before they've linked up, so before this shaft, so you've got imagine some men working here, and they would have been men in those days, working here, some navvies going down buckets, some men on the shaft we've just seen there, working down, and they're coming together. Before they're even linked up, they're going to come across some water. So how do they get that out? Well, yes, you've guessed this already. They're using the buckets again. So as well as lifting out all the rubble and rock, and the men going up and down, they would have to get the water out using buckets. So you can imagine it was a very labour intensive, very slow, very hard work to get the rock out, the men up and down, and the water out as well, all going on all at the same time. They did actually later on go into working Sundays and through the night as well. It doesn't make any difference where you work, day and night if you had daylight, because of course you're working down there with candlelight, and we'll come on to the actual excavation probably in part 2. But yeah, so dangerous work, but they did work through later on to increase the progress. What would have been quite a slow progress, even though you would have had lots of men working on it. Now, we've already mentioned about Robert Whitworth, who was main engineer to plan the route of the Thames and Severn Canal, but of course he wasn't going to actually be involved in the construction. You needed lots of navvies and somebody skilled enough to organise that. So who was the builder? Well, it's a gentleman called Charles Jones. We'll be touching on his story quite a bit during the course of the Sapperton. He was actually recommended to the commission to build the canal by Josiah Close, no less, who was an esteemed person to do with canals. He claimed also to be an experienced miner and essential skill for digging out a tunnel course, as well as being a craftsperson in terms of wood and stone. So he came with lots of skills. Unfortunately though, he also came with a whole barrel load of issues and problems. In October of 1783, building contractors tendering to do the work here on the Sapperton Tunnel arrived here in the Golden Valley, just to the east of the town of Stroud, the Cotswolds of course. Unfortunately, all they had to go on was a couple of temporary shafts, not even completely sunk, they were just minor shafts to show what the rock could be like, and also a flank cut out of the side of the hillside. That was it. So that they didn't really know what the deep underlying geology was to be like once they started cutting through it. The result of that was that 6 contractors tendered to compete for the work of this, and they put their bids in to get the work done. Now, the 6 contractors tendered prices varying from 6 guineas a yard to 14 guineas a yard to do the construction. Now, Charles Jones actually put in a bid for 8 guineas a yard, and his application was successful, although the committee wanting to build this canal and this tunnel drove down his price, and he then suggested he could do it for 8 guineas a yard. Now, the committee actually thought that that price was too low, which is why they didn't go for the cheapest offering. Negotiations happened, and eventually they settled for 7 guineas a yard, but that was to be far too cheap a price. Now, as well as agreeing a price, the other thing a contractor needs to do is agree a time frame. Charles Jones said that he could start on the 1st of January 1784 and could complete the work, the entire tunnel, in just 4 years. Now, that was a very, very ambitious target. One of the reasons for that was the Hare Castle tunnel, bear in mind that was a shorter tunnel, was actually done in 11 years. The other problem was that the committee did not know about Charles Jones's dishonesty and deceit. Well, welcome back. While you've been watching some ads, I've just been looking around the wood here and I've just discovered something. So that's our main shaft there, the second one from the Coates Portal direction. But there's another little sink in the woodland there. I wouldn't mind betting though that that was one of the original exploratory shafts that the contractors looked at when they came to the Golden Valley to see if they wanted a bid for the contract to do the work for the Sapperton Tunnel. I've no way of knowing that for sure, but the two are quite close by, remembering they would have used that cord stretching from the Coates end to the Sapperton end in a dead straight line. So then of course they realised that would have been offline, so they didn't widen that one or make it deeper down to the canal bed. Anyway, back to our Mr. Charles Jones. Now, unfortunately for the committee, they didn't know lots of things about him. They didn't know that when he left Manchester to come to Gloucestershire, that he'd left a load of debts. They also didn't know that he wasn't paying his men regularly to do the work, so morale was poor, work was slow. Worst of all, they didn't also know he was a very, very heavy drinker of alcohol, of course. Lots of problems then with Mr. Charles Jones, which meant lots of problems with the construction of the Sapperton Tunnel. So I've just come around to a couple of more shafts here. I can't film in front of this one because I'm on the top of a slope. It's very, very tricky terrain, but It's hard to see, I guess, but there's a fence around here. I don't know if you can just make that out. And the air shaft is just there. Now this here is the railway line. That is the Golden Valley Railway line. So that is the direction of Kemble, Swindon, and that's the direction of Stroud, Gloucester and Cheltenham. Main busy line down to Paddington. So I didn't realise that the canal air shaft is so close to the railway line. In fact, Sapperton Tunnel, railway tunnel, is a little bit further that way. The portal of it is about less than half a mile further on. But I've got one more air shaft to show you before we complete today's video here. But yeah, I thought I'd like to see that. And I'd say I didn't realise just how close to the track bed that air shaft is. It's very well supported and fenced off, but it's still very, very close. Now, the deceit and dishonesty of Mr. Charles Downes was one thing, but there's also a little bit of, well, slight underhandedness by the committee of the Thames and Severn Canal wanting to get this built. Now, what they decided to do is they wanted to increase the bore of the tunnel by 2.5 feet after it had been tendered, after they had agreed the price to get the work done. Furthermore, they wanted Mr. Charles Downes to line the entire tunnel length, which wasn't in the original agreement, or to the original cost, provided they provided the bricks. In order for them to do that, they needed to get him to agree to a new contract. So they took him to the Swan Inn in Stroud, which I walked past the other day actually. I'll insert a photograph of the Swan Inn now. Sadly, it's no longer open as an inn, but the sign is still there. I think it's Swan Lane off to one side of it. Anyway, I digress. They plied him with many, many drinks. Of course, knowing he was a drinker as well, they got him a bit blotto, forcing him to sign, and then probably using a bit of blotting paper as well, to sign on the dotted line to this a new agreement, which was a little bit unfair. So there's a bit of unfairness going on both sides of the agreement to build this tunnel. Now, this new contract that they got him to sign had a clause in it, the 28-day clause. So if he was absent for work for a period of more than 28 days, i.e. not on site, he could be away to do planning, etc. But if he was on that for more than 28 days, he would be dismissed from the contract and sacked, and he'd have to pay a large penalty as well. 10 days after signing the new agreement in the Swan Inn in Stroud, he was arrested for his debts that he'd left in Manchester. Now, as luck would have it, although he was put into a jail, he was actually released on the 27th day. Yes, can you believe that? Came out on the 27th day, thereby being able to return back here to the work site. So he didn't actually break the 28-day agreement, so work could then continue. But work was still very slow on progress of building the Sapperton Tunnel. Things were going to get complicated still. The workmanship was not to a high standard. In fact, nearly a year after work had started in 1784, towards the end of 1784, the portal at Sapperton End completely collapsed. Worse than that, they hadn't made headway to join the headways together. It meant that water was progressing in badly, and it meant other collapses in the tunnel, even though the whole length had yet, well, there's a long way off being completed. Lots of issues then. Further to that, his son, George, started making murderous accusations to one Samuel Smith, who was one of the key members of the committee of the Thames and Severn proprietors. So lots of things going on, workmanship not going on, problems with tunnel collapses, problems with debtor prisons. He was still in and out of debtor prisons after his release from Manchester because of other debts he had right across the country. So the construction of the Sapperton Tunnel was not going smoothly at all. By June of 1785, the committee gave Charles Downes 3 months to quit or make good all of the work which had been done unsatisfactory to date, and repair everything and make also significant progress with building this Sapperton Tunnel. There was counterclaims. He was trying to sue them, they were trying to sue him because they'd got him drunk in the Swan Inn. He was trying to take them to court, they were trying to take him to court. Things came to a head towards the end of 1785, and Charles Downes left the operation of the Sapperton Tunnel and they then repitched for new bids. In fact, the courts and counter-courts and claims went on right up until 1789, but it was thrown out of court and he wasn't actually sued, and they weren't taken to court either. I'll tell you some more about the construction of the Sapperton Tunnel in part 2 here on the Secrets of the Thames and Severn Canal. Well, that's it for today from the Secrets of the Thames and Severn Canal, part number 6, but our first instalment looking at the history of the amazing and incredible Sapperton Tunnel. Part 2 for the Sapperton Tunnel here on Secrets of the Thames and Severn Canal on West Country Wanderings will arrive in the new year. I also plan to another one in my companion series, Secrets of the Stroud Water, which will also be arriving probably end of January, early February time. And as we head into early spring, I also hope to be doing another one of my Cotswold Canals updates, and that'll be part number 18. So look out for that, because lots of things have been happening, lots of exciting news to bring you, and that'll probably be arriving early February, or probably late February actually, early into March. So look out for that. So if you like those sort of things to do with canals in Gloucestershire, and I also cover the Wilts and Barks. I'm hoping to head down to Swindon shortly to have a look at the new section of the Wilts and Barks that's open there. Then why not consider subscribing to the channel? I do with the videos as well. But if you like the canals, then YouTube will notify you when the next one is uploaded on the channel. Until next time, West Country Wanderings, take care of yourselves, look after yourselves, and I hope to see you on the channel again very, very soon. All the best for now. Take care. Bye-bye.